in southeastern Norway, a place of lush green valleys in summer and endless expanses of snow and ice in winter. Between the town of Rjukan and the tiny hamlet of Vinge, at the western edge of Lake Mosfossen. Like most Northmen, Nordstrom had learned to ski these mountains before he even rode a bike. He grew up hunting and fishing in the way boys in other places kicked footballs around. To this day, the network of huts and cabins that dotted the Hardangervidda were as familiar to him as were the lines on his own hands. His father still lived in Rjukan, though Nordstrom dared not visit him now. At least, not directly. Nordstrom was known to be one of those who had escaped to the hills and continued to fight against the Nazis. It was common knowledge that the NS police kept an eye on the family members of known resistance fighters in the hope of tracking them down. The Herden of the National Samling Party were everywhere, as fearful in their tactics as the Gestapo. Followers of the puppet dictator Vidkun Quisling, they had forsaken their country and king to do the Nazis' bidding. It had been 2 years since Nordstrom had seen his father, and it was unlikely he would on this trip. On the aft deck, dressed in workman's clothes and carrying a satchel of carpentry tools, but with a Browning .45 in his belt, Nordstrom sat back as the boat came in sight of the familiar mountains of his youth ringing the Tinnsjø. It felt good to be back in his valley. He let his face soak up the sun. He hadn't seen much of the sun lately. Since April 1940, when he'd left the university in his second year of engineering school to make his way up to Narvik and join the British trying to blockade the Nazi invaders, the blue skies of Norway had seemed under a perpetual leaden cloud. At first they'd managed to hold them off. The Germans focused their blitzkrieg on the cities. First Trondheim, then Bergen, and Oslo fell in a week. Then the king took flight, first to Nybergsund, and then on to Elverum, near the Swedish border, and the people knelt in the street and wept. Nordstrom had seen his share of fighting, in Hønefoss and Klekko and the Gudbrandsdal Valley. A year ago in Tønnesen, he hooked up with what was left of a militia unit, a small group of men in tattered uniforms who would not give up. "Here," they said, and put a krog in his hand with only 30 rounds of ammunition. "That's all you get, I'm afraid," the captain said apologetically. "Better make them count." Boys. That was all they were, with rifles and Molotov cocktails to make them men, and down to a single cannon taken out of mothballs from the last war. No one knew how to wage a fight. Still, they'd left their mark on the bastards. They blew up bridges, disrupted supply lines and motorcades, ambushed a couple of high-ranking SS officers. They'd put an end to a few Quisling traders as well. At Haugsbygda, the fighting became close in, knives and bayonets when the bullets ran out, until they were no longer going up against soldiers and machine guns, but tanks and artillery and nose-diving fighters unloading bombs. 50mm shells rained in from a mile away and blew their trenches into the sky. "You're a sergeant," they told him, mainly because Nordstrom, who'd grown up a hunter, could shoot with the best, and because he'd seen his share of bloodshed. He was tall and well-built, with a high forehead and short light hair, and a kind of purposefulness in his gray, deep-set eyes that from his youth people seemed willing to follow. His looks had hardened now. 2 years of watching limbs blown in the air and a man next to you dropped by one to the forehead had made him appear 10 years older. But somehow he was still alive. His ranks had long since splintered. Most of his friends were dead. Now it was simply do whatever he could do. The king had made it to London. Nordstrom had heard they were forming some kind of free Norwegian army there. England. Maybe in 40, it might have been possible to find your way there. 250 kilometers across the Vidda, through blistering storms to Sweden, and then hop a neutral ship. Today, it might as well be China. He'd made the trek to Sweden once, after fleeing Narvik, but finding little support there, came back to resume the fight. And even if you made it all the way to England, and weren't sunk to the bottom of the North Sea, or handed back over by the Swedish police to the wrong people, yes, you could join up. And then what? Sit